literally taking this as holiday.
Hello. Good morning and welcome to the first of what will be 7 Centre for Policy Studies and CapEx events today, including an in-conversation with Grant Shapps this afternoon. So I'd encourage you all to take a look at our agenda and turn up for our wonderful range of events today. This morning, though, we're going to be talking about taking back control, the challenges of legal and illegal migration. I'll be sharing a discussion. I'm Karl, the Deputy Research Director at the CPS. And I will introduce our wonderful panel of guests in a minute. Just a bit of housekeeping first. If we can make sure phones are on silent if possible. We have a collection of reports at the back, including stopping the crossings on this very topic. Please feel free to pick up at the end of the session. We will be ending with a 15 or 20 minute Q&A, so please keep that in mind and formulate questions as we go along. So, taking back control. Since 2018, 110,000 migrants have crossed the English Channel in the small boats. That's equivalent to a small town the size of Worcester, or Maidstone, or Rochdale. The asylum backlog has reached record levels. The hotel bill for migrants is now £8 million per day. The linchpin of the government's strategy for dealing with the crisis is the Miranda scheme, and of course that's currently awaiting a Supreme Court judgment. Meanwhile, legal migration has reached record highs, 606,000 last year, more than twice the pre-Brexit average. So clearly we have some massive challenges to talk about today, and a big thank you to our panel of fantastic guests who are going to be tackling these big questions. So we have the Right Honourable Robert Jenrick, MP for Newark and Minister for Immigration. We have Nick Timothy, the Chair of the Future of Conservatism Project at Onward, and co-author of the CPS report Stopping the Crossings. We have journalist Poppy Coburn, who is assistant opinion editor at the Telegraph and has written extensively on immigration and adjacent topics. And we have David Goodhart, head of Demography, Integration and Immigration at Policy Exchange, and author of various paradigm-defining books such as The Road to Somewhere. So we're going to kick off with some opening remarks in turn from each of our panellists. Robert, would you like to?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for hosting us here today, and thank you to the CPS for the reports that you've done over the course of the last few years, stopping the boats in particular. They have really contributed to the government's agenda and to the Illegal Migration Act in particular, which we passed at the beginning of the summer, and which, when fully brought into force, I think will prove to be one of the most significant pieces of legislation on immigration in my lifetime. It's possibly the most robust piece of immigration legislation since the Second World War. And as soon as we can get through the Supreme Court and begin our policy on Rwanda, I think you'll start to see the benefits of that in instilling a genuine deterrent for the first time to those seeking to cross the Channel illegally and to the people smuggling gangs behind them. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because we've entered an age of mass migration. You see that right across Europe. You see it on the southern border of the United States. You see it in many, if not most, developed countries around the world. And unlike some of the previous European migration crises, I don't think this is necessarily just a passing one where in a few years' time, for geopolitical reasons or otherwise, it will fade away. The 21st century will be marked by millions of people on the move, seeking to come to wealthier, developed countries like our own. And because the UK is one of the most attractive countries in the world, we will face very large, unprecedented numbers of people seeking to come here. And if you believe in the nation state, in the sovereignty of our borders, then you have to put in place a plan, a system which can defend them. And that is what we're seeking to do with the Rwanda policy, with the Illegal Migration Act. When I came to office a year ago with the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister, I think it's fair to say that our borders were in some disarray. We were in a difficult position. I'd like to think that a year on we are making progress. The numbers crossing the Channel illegally are down by 25%. In the recent months, the key months of the year, they're down by 40% in September and August. If that trend continues, then that's positive news. But none of us should be complacent. We promised to stop the boats, and that's what we're setting out to achieve. We also need to get the back office processes right because as Conservatives we believe in good government, good administration, and so part of my role I see as the sort of Sir John Harvey Jones of the Home Office, trying to fix some of the problems that we have, like the backlog, like the way we accommodate migrants, like the return of migrants who've come here illegally back to their home countries. And you'll see over the course of the autumn that in each of those areas we are making progress. So the number of people being returned is up 75%. The backlog is now falling, and I think will fall substantially over the course of the autumn. We're also accommodating people in less luxurious ways, which will make the pull factor to the UK much less. And here in the UK, we're setting out to make it a much harder place for migrants to live and to work illegally, taking up some of the things that, in fact, Nick and Theresa May did when they were in the Home Office, like restarting bank checks on illegal migrants. 6,000 of those have happened already this year. There's a 50% increase in the number of raids on car washes and care homes and so on, where people are being employed illegally. We have to make the UK a more challenging environment for people smugglers and illegal migrants. That's how we'll get a grip on this problem. Briefly on legal migration, because I know that's going to feature in part of this discussion as well. I think the age of mass migration that we're living in completely validates the decision to leave the EU. It's already clear that having control of those levers is incredibly important and will be even more so in the decades to come. I think it's also true, to speak honestly with you, that after leaving the European Union, we ended up creating a system that was, if anything, more liberal than the one that we had beforehand. It's led to more people coming into the country legally in very large numbers, and that's why we have to do something about that. We've got to make changes to the system now, and the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and I are committed to doing that, because that is what the British public have been asking us as politicians to do for decades. That's why so many people voted to leave the European Union just a few years ago. We have to not just take back control of the levers of immigration, but actually exercise them to bring control to our migration system. And that's my role as Immigration Minister. That's what the Home Secretary and I are determined to do.
Thank you, Robert. Some really interesting things to drill down into there in a bit. Nick?
Well, thank you, Karl. I joined the Home Office in 2010 as a special advisor, and I had a full head of hair. and I came out in 2015 looking like this. It's a really hard place to work. The issues are really tough, and you're not fully in control of all the levers that you would like to pull. So the things that Rob just said about what this Home Office team has done with the channel crossings, I think I would actually congratulate you for the work you've done in this period, because while Rwanda is not yet off the ground, the flight's on off the ground, the work that you've done in particular with the agreement with Albania to make sure that Albanians are removed immediately upon arriving from across the channel has made a huge effect, and that's the reason why the numbers are down this year. So there is really good work taking place in the Home Office right now. I think we should set this in a proper context. Karl mentioned that overall net migration in the last year was 606,000. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, we've had more immigration to Britain in the last quarter century than we have in the last 2,000 years. And the public don't want it. At every election where one party has said we will reduce the numbers or we will control the border, and in a referendum too, that was the side that won. Because people really care about this and they want the numbers down, and they have good reasons to want the numbers down. It's not just a democratic thing. There are good social reasons because of the pace of change. There are good cultural reasons because actually we should value who and what we are. There are good economic reasons because mass immigration just incentivizes companies to go on hiring cheap migrant work rather than to invest in the skills of our own people or into labour-saving technology. So we need to get these numbers down for all sorts of reasons. And it's really important when we talk about the channel crossings, because you sometimes hear some people on the left say, well, you know, these numbers are actually quite small, more than 100,000, as Karl said. But actually, they're a significant chunk of the flow of people coming into country every year. And if we want to be a successful country and we want to respond to what the public want and need, then we need control. Now, the problem that we have, perversely, we always used to think having a sea border protected us. Funnily enough, it's actually harder to limit the channel crossings, precisely because it is a sea border than a land border, because we can't just construct a wall and keep people out. So it's basically, as soon as they're in our waters, we have obligations, and people can come ashore and claim asylum. And then when they do, it is then very difficult to remove them, even if their asylum claim is rejected, for a variety of reasons. They can melt into the black economy, they can make all sorts of never-ending human rights claims. When we try to remove people, certain countries refuse to recognise their own nationals. So you're caught in this kind of trap of enforcement and bureaucracy and human rights law and international diplomacy. And the truth is, the reason why everyone wants to make the journey is because they know that if they get to Britain, there's very little chance, notwithstanding the work of the Home Office, that they will ever be removed again, which is why the Rwanda scheme is actually so important, because France is never going to agree to take all of these people back, and even if they did, they'd probably just try again. So we need to be able to get people to a third country, and the Rwanda deal, this idea was always mocked by people on the left. They said, oh, which country is this? Which island is this? It's a fantasy island. Well, the government actually did negotiate the deal with Rwanda, and we have the deal in place. So now it's about trying to make the Rwanda deal work, and we're awaiting the decision of the judges. Even if the judges in this country say that it can go ahead, we still have the risk that the Strasbourg court will impose an injunction saying it can't go ahead until they've considered the case, which is why I think ultimately the key to the channel crossings is how we resolve this question of our human rights laws. And in particular, we can't fudge it, we can't say, well, we'll stay in the ECHR, we'll have a Bill of Rights that works a bit differently to the Human Rights Act. Ultimately, the question is, what are we going to do about the ECHR, which has changed beyond all recognition from when it was first devised shortly after the Second World War. It's a living instrument. The definition of the rights have changed beyond all recognition. The way the court itself operates has changed beyond all recognition, including these injunctions, which nobody ever actually agreed should be legally binding, but have somehow become legally binding. So we have to have a conversation about the ECHR, and that is, I think, something that's really starting to happen in the party.
Thank you, Nick. A compelling case for control there. Poppy?
Yes,
Please.
I think it's quite interesting, this discussion of how we're moving into an era of almost permanent mass migration. You know, I think if you had told people on the 23rd of June in 2016 that we would end up in a situation where mainland Europe is far to the right of Britain in terms of migration, both in rhetoric in many cases and in policy, well, I'm not sure how that would have swayed the vote on the day. But, you know, I think it's quite difficult to talk about how to deal with illegal migration unilaterally, and I think this is unfortunately something that we're going to see. And of course, as Nick has mentioned, this isn't just a case of the European Court of Human Rights. It's also, you know, once people have entered European waters, it's incredibly difficult to then deal with the processing to remove them from this process. So it's quite interesting to see what Europe has been doing through Frontex, and there's been some quite, you know, unpleasant situations with how people have been treated in Libya. You know, certainly things that we would find to be morally unjust in some cases. But if we are indeed entering this era of mass migration, and you know, this is not just a repeat of 2015, this is 2015 every year, maybe at double the scale, triple the scale for the next decade, next 50 years, we do need to have some degree of joined up thinking with the continent. You know, we are going to actually have to deal with some collaboration with them. This is not necessarily something that we can do alone. But it's quite interesting to see how Britain has become a bit of a thought leader in terms of Rwanda. I mean, Olaf Scholz, even, of Germany, has praised the Rwanda scheme in his very German, slightly reluctant sense. You know, but it's very difficult to take a politically polarised position to this, because it is a bit of a technocratic issue. So obviously we can look to the example of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who you know, was elected on a platform of right populism, A lot of her programme was based on the idea of processing illegal migrants. Well, numbers under her have tripled. And then we can look to somewhere like Denmark. Denmark, I think, in the public consciousness is quite a moderate country, not particularly politically polarised, which is trying to pursue a zero asylum seeker policy. To also touch as well slightly on the legal migration aspect of this, because I do think this is an important component to discussion, if only in terms of numbers. This is also something that requires some degree of joined-up thinking. So, we can look to the good work that's been done by the Home Secretary, and it's not something that can just be controlled to one department. The British economy is actually quite reliant on immigration, and this is something that's been done by design. But you do have to take into consideration, what are we going to do about social care visas? What are we going to do about, workers for the NHS? We do need to have some consensus within the party that this is an incredibly pressing issue, and one that also must take precedence if we want to see some serious action being done to get those numbers down in the long term. But yes, I hope this is something that we can discuss further on in the talk.
Thank you, Poppy. So I think we'll definitely return to the European context there. David.
Okay, thanks, Karl. Well, I'm going to find myself, I think, in the slightly unusual position of being the kind of liberal outrider on this panel, partly because I want to address the question of safe and legal routes. Robert will tell you rightly that we do have safe and legal routes. 500,000 people have come through them since 2015, mainly from the Ukraine, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, Syria, and so on. And so long as irregular entry is running as high as it is, no government is going to be incentivised to open up new routes. I do understand and accept that, but I do think it's been a political mistake not to stress now what could and should happen after irregular entry is brought down to sufficiently low levels. When the government says, look at this 500,000 number, the NGOs say, with some reason, yes, but there's no generic safe and legal route for the persecuted Christian in Pakistan or the gay activist in Iran. And when the government says the free-for-all in the Channel is a form of queue jumping, the NGOs will say, but where is the queue? And I think those are actually reasonable questions, and I think we should have answers to them. And we do actually have an answer, or rather we have a model for the safe and legal route of the future, and that model was the Syria scheme that we had that ran for 5 years from 2015 to 2020. We took about 20,000 people in that period. We had a close relationship with the UNHCR. We basically said to the UNHCR, select us, the people who are most endangered or most vulnerable, who are on your register. They weren't actually mainly coming from UNHCR camps. These were people who were living in Lebanon or Turkey or somewhere. And we had a very, very effective cooperation between central government and local authorities in this country, and it worked very, very well. And that is the model for a future generic, safe and legal route. It should obviously be capped. We could have an argument about what the level should be, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. It obviously depends on what is happening elsewhere on the immigration story. I think the other big thing that has changed recently is the Homes for Ukraine scheme, and there was a great deal of scepticism in government in Whitehall about the ability of these sorts of schemes, sponsorship schemes effectively, to work. And I think that the Ukraine scheme hasn't been perfect, but it has shown 120,000 British people opened their doors to Ukrainians for at least a year. The numbers are dropping off now. There is fatigue in the system, but it really has worked pretty well. And I think in the future, when we've got irregular entry down, the other, as well as having a kind of generic Syria-type safe and legal route, capped obviously, we should hugely boost sponsorship, community sponsorship and family sponsorship. Canada takes in about 8,000 people a year through this route. And the other thing we should do is ask the diaspora organisations to step up here. And I'm not quite sure why that doesn't happen already. You know, the British Iranian Association, the British Afghan Society, or, you know, all of for the places where people are coming across the channel in large numbers, these communities should be stepping up and saying, you know, we will take, you know, a certain number of people every year. So I think a Syrian model safe and legal route, a big expansion of sponsorship is something that we should be talking about now when we have, you know, with a view to putting into practice when the numbers are down. And I think the great benefit of sponsorship, seeing a much bigger role for sponsorship, is it addresses the three main anxieties that people have about, particularly about irregular flows, which is essentially the huge cost. Now, obviously, there's still some cost, but when some of that cost is being borne by the sponsors, that means the taxpayer is responsible for less of it. Anxieties about integration, again, particularly if the diaspora groups are stepping up. You know, you have people who are already, you know, speak good English, who understand British society, who can introduce their co-nationals to our society, and the security element. Obviously, when people are coming over on boats in irregular entry, it's much harder to screen people for the security issues. But I would also stress that, you know, even if we do get irregular entry down substantially, the boats, people coming over on boats count for about half of all irregular entry at the moment. There's still a lot of people coming on lorries, and there are at least 20, I think 25,000 people who overstay visas every year. So we are still going to need to have returns agreements with lots of countries. You know, we're still going to be able to have to deal with the problem of not being able to deport people. So we won't be able to let our guard down on that. Thanks.
Thank you, David. I see some of our other panellists restraining themselves a bit there, so I think we'll definitely return to that topic of safe and legal routes shortly. Before then, though, I think if we're going to talk about solving the problem of the small boats in the Channel, we really need to understand the causes. And we've heard a lot about the global context, age of migration. How much is there in Britain's situation that is particular to Britain, and how much are we at the mercy of wider forces? What things can we control, and what lessons can we learn from other countries such as the US, Australia, Europe? So, Robert, would you like to?
Well, the UK, you know, is with other European countries. We are slightly different from most European countries in that we are exclusively a destination country, and so most other European countries are either a transit country or a combination of transit and destination. Even countries like Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, if you don't successfully get asylum there or you don't like the conditions, you can keep moving. And many of the people who claim asylum in the UK have claimed asylum in numerous other European countries first. So our position is slightly different. As Nick says, anyone who comes here is not going anywhere unless we can return them. And returns are very challenging for all the reasons that Nick rightly set out. I think if you asked a European audience about the UK, they would say it's too easy to live and to work in the UK illegally. And that's one of the things that we have set out to do as a team, the Home Secretary and I, building on the work, as I said earlier, that Nick and Theresa May did during their time in the Home Office. After Windrush, for understandable reasons, I think there was a loss of confidence on some of these issues, and the Home Office has had to consider carefully how it returns to them in an appropriate way, but we have returned to some of those things like checking bank accounts with the banks, and that's the right thing to do. We've massively increased the fines for employers and landlords who are employing or letting properties to illegal workers, because I don't think that's a victimless crime. It's an integral part of the business model of the people smugglers that someone can come here predominantly as an economic migrant or at least as an asylum shopper and get into the employment, the black economy sort of market very quickly when they're here. That's something we need to do more on to make the UK a more challenging environment. I do think that we need to work very closely with other European countries, just as others have said, and we've set out to do that over the last 12 months, building better relationships with France. I've been to Tunisia, Algeria, Italy, Belgium, Turkey, you name it, to try and be a strategic partner to any European or indeed countries further afield who share our determination to tackle this issue. But I don't believe in what Keir Starmer says, which is essentially that you can arrest your way out of this problem, or that those sorts of agreements alone will make the difference. You do have to ultimately have a major deterrent effect. That's why, as Nick has said, that Rwanda, I think, is so important. And we used to look to Australia as the example as to why that would succeed. Now you look to the Albanian deal, because the Albanian deal is returning people very swiftly. When I was in Tirana a few weeks ago, we had young men who had been in the UK for as little as 48 hours who are now back on Albanian soil because of that. And in fact, we've returned 3,500, which is not all of the Albanians who've come to the UK illegally, but was enough to create the deterrent effect that's led to a 92% reduction in the number of Albanians. So I think that where we will be different to Europe is by implementing this very strong deterrent effect. And that is something that other European countries are looking to as novel, creative, and they would like to create something similar themselves.
Poppy, I don't know if you'd like to come in on the American context.
Yeah. Just in fact, first, it kind of prompted my memory when we were talking about the European context, just very briefly. When I was talking earlier about the need to have a bit of work with our continental neighbours, by that I don't mean what the Labour Party had put forward, which is the idea of essentially taking, realistically the number would be, I think, 120,000 people you'd be looking at under any kind of agreement strategy, if one could ever be agreed, and that of course could not happen. We just have to look at the last 15 years within the European Union context to realise that many member states will refuse, and far more now than they would in 2015. What I meant by stopping people, it's before entering European soil, and this is why agreements between Europe is so important. We've seen in the example of George Maloney, where she tried to set up a deal with Tunisia, which was predicated again, somewhat similar to the Rwanda plan, of stopping people coming from the source. And this is not proven to be very successful. The deal unfortunately fell apart. It's actually very, very difficult to essentially bribe nations, whether that be your European neighbours, who are travelling through as a transit country, to keep them in that transit country and have that be their final destination, or to even stop people from the source. It's very, very difficult to do that from a kind of carrot versus a stick perspective. But this is one of the reasons why America is quite interesting. If we look at the scale of the legal migration, the American border, it's always unbelievable. And they really are facing very similar challenges to the ones we are. So New York City, I don't know if any of you have seen the viral videos that have been going around on Twitter of thousands of people, predominantly men, essentially just camped out on the streets of very nice neighbourhoods in New York, trying to stay in hotels. I think the cost just in New York of housing this new flood of illegal migrants coming in, or those seeking asylum, I think it's now $1 billion a year, and that's looking to increase. So this is not a problem that we are facing on our own. These same problems of mass transit are occurring across the world. What's different between us and America is America can act more unilaterally, just because of the size of the country and the geographic positioning of it. Their disputes, rather than ours with Europe, will be within the states. So you can see the position of Texas is obviously quite hostile towards that of Washington. And again, we've seen some quite high-profile stunts from Republican lawmakers like Ron DeSantis busing illegal migrants from Florida up to Martha's Vineyard to stay with rich Democratic lawmakers. So yeah, it's the scale, I think, in America is somewhat different, but there are also more tools at their disposal. They are not restrained by European Court of Human Rights. They are able to act in a unilateral fashion. Also, the degree of their problem is much larger, but they're facing similar challenges, but they have more tools at their disposal.
Brilliant. Nick, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's a point well made that this is not a problem that is unique to Britain, and I get frustrated sometimes with the media coverage because it is often made to feel as though actually the scale of the problem we face is particularly bad, or that our political response is particularly tough. I was talking to a friend who is a journalist in Berlin last week, who told me that in Germany there are now 460,000 Afghan nationals, 1 million Syrians, and 200,000 asylum seekers arrived in Germany between January and August this year. So these are huge, huge numbers. And actually, Germany has its own pull factors, Britain has its own pull factors, but actually these things are happening in countries right across Europe. And the response to that, from some on the left would be to say, well, this just goes to show we actually don't take our fair share. Or therefore we need to start entering into burden sharing agreements with European countries, which we didn't do that when we were members of the European Union. And I remember in Justice and Home Affairs Council meetings where the Germans would sometimes say, well, we need to start talking about burden sharing so that we can send more of the asylum seekers who are in Germany to other parts of the EU. The other European countries went absolutely mad, because the whole reason this is happening is because you opened our borders and you said we can do this and invited the world to come to Europe. So no, we don't want to share your burden that you created. So to me, actually what these numbers mean is that actually the West is going to really have to change its attitude to this kind of migration. And that might manifest itself in lots of different ways. So, when I was in the Home Office, Libya, it used to act as Europe's forward border, but we smashed up the Libyan state, so that doesn't happen anymore. The Europeans have obviously entered into agreements with Turkey, which have helped to some degree. They won't really address the elephant in the room, which is Schengen, which in many ways is as stupid as the single currency. It's causing huge problems in terms of tackling illegal migration and movement around Europe. But at some point, and I think actually the interesting thing about what's going on in America, it was briefly held up as an exemplar, as an alternative to the sort of cruel Tories and the cruel Rwanda policy. The Americans ended up offering more visas to nationals from the high migration countries than the numbers of people from those countries who had recently gone to America. And it still hasn't limited the flow of people into America. So they've just given out more visas, and the flow of illegal migration has continued to rise. And that's obviously the response to the argument that you can only fix the channel crossings with safe and legal routes, because that could only stop the crossings if those safe and legal routes were available to literally everybody who would want to make the journey. And of course, it would create its own demand anyway. So I think if you look at these lessons from America or around Europe, actually the West collectively is going to have to change its attitude to these things. It's going to have a much more secure external border. At some point, Schengen is surely going to come under question. There's not much pro-immigration politics going on the continent, I can assure you. And we're going to need to start having conversations, as Suella said last week, about these international legal frameworks that adjudicate what we can do in terms of removing people or making asylum decisions. So that is the ECHR, but it's also the Refugee Convention, which is completely perverse because it only places obligations on the country that receives a migrant. It doesn't place any obligation on the country that they're from or the countries that they pass through or anybody. It just says, well, you'll have to accept this person in circumstances which are defined in ways that are ever growing. So the West is going to have to change very profoundly, I think.
Well, just a quick one. I mean, Poppy is right in that things are changing quite fast in Europe. I think we now have a lot of allies in Europe for, if not Rwanda, exactly kind of Rwanda-style solutions. And I think the whole of the developed world, the whole of Europe anyway, is going to have to come round to an approach towards refugee and asylum immigration that is similar to legal migration. Essentially, we select, not the people carriers and not members of the... I mean, the underlying issue is not going to go away for another 50 or 100 years. I mean, we're talking about the people who are coming are mainly better off people, the kind of middle class of poorer countries. And those poor countries are not going to become decent places to live for many generations hence. So the problem isn't going to go away. And I think, well, contrary to Poppy, I think we are essentially, there is no alternative to essentially bribing the countries on the southern and eastern flanks of Europe. I mean, we don't just bribe them with money. Obviously, that hasn't worked very well in the case of Tunisia. But presumably the Tunisians are involved, regard themselves as involved in a negotiation. I mean, by allowing those people to, what was it, 11,000, 7,000 people to move from Tunisia to Lampedusa, they were saying to the European Union, you know, 1 billion euros is not enough. Look what we can do. You know, perhaps 5 billion might be a good start. But there is really no alternative. I mean, a combination of literally bribing people, but also having agreements with the relevant countries for degrees of time-restricted legal migration, student migration, you know, using development aid. I mean, this should be, you know, one of the primary objects of development aid should be focused on those countries through which people are coming to Europe. And, you know, there is, you know, apart from a kind of a military solution, there is no alternative to bribery.
So I think we've talked a fair bit about the causes and long-term context of the migration crisis, and it strikes me that however we approach dealing with this, whatever route we take, it's going to take time to come into effect, and it's going to take time to bring international partners into the same position. How do we address some of the symptoms in the meantime? And in particular, I'm thinking about the migrants and hotels and the asylum backlog, which seems to be one of the more politically contentious and visible areas of the crisis.
Well, since that's my responsibility, I should really start with that one. I mean, the first thing to say is you're right to characterise those as symptoms, and those on the left tend to see that as the whole of the problem. And if only you had the most well-oiled machine in terms of processing claims, and you looked after people in the, you know, the best possible quality accommodation. Because Labour MPs don't write to me saying close down hotels, they write to me saying that the hotels aren't good enough. That would be the solution. That isn't the solution. The solution is to put in place the deterrent effect and to do the things upstream that we've just been describing. But that doesn't mean that it's not important to get those things right, because we don't want to waste taxpayers' money. We want an efficient, well-run Home Office and asylum system as far as one can in the middle of an asylum and immigration crisis. And bear in mind, the issues that we have are not unique to the UK. Every European country is struggling with how do you accommodate migrants, the backlog, how do you return people, and many of the solutions that we're turning to, which the British media consider to be very extreme or inhumane, like accommodating somebody in a barge or using a disused military site, are things that almost every other European country is doing. You know, in fact, they're doing things that are significantly more robust than that. But I think they're important. What we've done is firstly to get the back office of the Home Office right. And for a range of reasons, one of which was COVID, because the Home Office effectively stopped doing face-to-face interviews during COVID of asylum seekers, and that did lead to a very large spike in the number of people waiting for their claims to be assessed. The numbers got very high. We've put in place now the processes necessary to bring that down, and despite the speculation that you may have read in the press, it is not to do with amnesties like the last Labour government did. Actually, what's brought the backlog down is just good management, having the right leadership, having targets, using financial incentives and overtime for the staff who work there so that they're working 7 days a week, not doing interviews that last 7 hours when they can be done in 45 minutes. It's just good conservative management of the system that's brought that down, and I think you'll see very rapidly now over the course of the autumn the backlog coming down to a much more sensible and sustainable level. The fact that the number of people crossing is down markedly and down a lot compared to what we feared. I mean, bearing in mind, when I walked into the Home Office, I was given a reasonable worst-case scenario that 85,000 people might cross the Channel in small boats this year, and seeing what's happening in Italy, that wasn't scaremongering. That could well have been the case, but it's down by 25% instead of increasing by 100%.
Is that the France agreement or the weather?
It's not well, there's a lot of people who say it's just the weather, but we're now 9 or 10 months into the year, and so I think that is not the case. It is due to Albania. That's I think the single best intervention that we've done is Albania. There is more French activity. There is more work by the NCA and our allies upstream. There are more returns. It's a somewhat more challenging environment for people to live and to work in. So there's many different things coming together, but there does seem to be a reduction in demand and in the ability of people smugglers to get people across the Channel. But I don't want to overstate that, because the public don't want to see a 25% reduction. They want to see a 100% reduction. But to the point I was making, I think we are now in a place where the system is in a significantly better health than it was just 12 months ago, and you're going to see that steadily improve over the course of the year. But I wouldn't get into the kind of left narrative that just fixing the back office processes is going to stop the boats. It's the right thing to do, but it's not a strategy to protect our borders. That's where we differ so strongly from the Labour Party. We think that you have to put in place a deterrent. You've got to break the business model of the people smugglers once and for all.
Just to pick up on the point of hotels, I mean, this is why trying to bring some order into the system is so important, because if it's done in this disorderly way, then by definition there is no control, and you're constantly firefighting and engaged in crisis management. If there is control, if you do manage to reduce, ideally eliminate illegal crossings, that is when you can then say, well, let's have a conversation about safe and legal routes and how we bring people over. Now, David mentioned what we did during the Syria crisis, where that I think is what you should aim to do. It was done through the UN. It was targeted at people who specifically needed help and the kind of life that we could offer here. They were much more likely to be women and girls compared to men. The huge majority of the people crossing the Channel are young, able-bodied men, and it also gives scope to the community sponsorship idea, which I think is very powerful, and we started to get off the ground when I was in the Home Office. And I should, at this point, mention Simon and Jill Delatte, who's in the front row, who are who live in West Suffolk, where I'm the candidate. They've sponsored a Ukrainian national. I actually went through my wife and I went through the application process for sponsoring a Ukrainian national. This is the ideal way to do it, because it helps, as you say, it helps with integration, and it helps with the capacity of the country to sustain these kinds of numbers. There are, however, still some grounds for concern. There is still a limit to what we can do. The numbers still do need to be limited. And I think we do have to be a little bit careful with the extent to which it's done entirely through diaspora institutions, because some of those diaspora institutions are not always quite so integrated as we would like them to be. But the key to all of this is control.
Just on that final point, I have to push back slightly on the idea that there are not already diaspora institutions that are dedicated to the sponsorship, even if it's not necessarily a formalised one. We have a vast network of charitable organisations in this country, many of whom receive government money, who work purely for the process of simplifying the immigration processing procedures, some of whom are not entirely legitimate and above board. There was a Daily Mail investigation into lawyers basically telling people how to do asylum shopping. One of the firms that was shut down was actually on my road. I walked past it every morning on my way to work. And I remember once taking a photo of it. It was remarkable. There was a queue of men outside coming into this solicitor's building. It's been shut down now. But there's another one just along the road, which wasn't named in the report, which I assume is doing the exact same thing. You know, the ward I used to live in, Kensington, Chelsea, had a body that they were actually giving money to. I think it was £50,000 a year that was coming from the Conservative-led council to a group called Migrants Organise. And this was the same group that had signed an open letter calling Suella Braverman a fascist, which was quite remarkable. So there are already plenty of networks simplifying our immigration procedures on the basis of you know, inter-ethnic solidarity or broader humanistic
I'm talking about something. I mean, you know, the British Iranians are a very well-established, rather affluent group. You know, lots of doctors and lawyers amongst them, and you know, they will have the capacity to, you know, if in the future when we've got irregular movement under control, we might want to say, well, you know, we want to take, you know, Iran is still an oppressive theocracy. We want to take 2,000 Iranians a year. They'd have to come, obviously, from outside the country.
What measures would there be on bad behaviour being committed by these organisations? Are we not just setting ourselves up for a bureaucratic nightmare in the future? You know, would there be any sanctions on, you know, bad behaviour if we were to spot it? Are we not just legitimising groups that could potentially be misused? You know, you've given an interesting example here of the illegal migration stopping or coming under control. I just don't believe that's true. I don't really see a situation where that's going to happen. And to draw back a bit again on the hotels crisis, you know, this was supposed to be a short-term solution, but the problem isn't going away. And unfortunately, with the chaos in the hotels, it builds a narrative up for an amnesty. You know, and I think unfortunately this is something that the Labour Party has embraced wholeheartedly. They get to point and say, look how much money we're spending every year, we're spending billions of pounds every year. You know, you have to walk past these hotels on your way to school. You know how much money is being wasted. You know, this is upsetting your community. It's creating tensions. Well, we've solved the problem. You know, here's an amnesty. They're now no longer in the hotels, and they're just dissipating into the towns and cities. And this is still a problem, but it's one that's, you know, it's less direct, and it's not something you can point your finger at and say this is a problem. And again, if we're dealing with this backlog, what does that actually mean? Are we deporting people? I mean, how many people are actually being removed from the country? This is still, I think, one of the most fundamental problems the Home Office is facing is, you know, we're getting people, we're saying you have to leave the country, but they're not going, they're not being removed. You know, I was reading through high court cases of immigration law. There was one woman who had entered the country on the day I was born in 2000, and she's, I think, had 7 cases of going backwards and forwards at the High Court. You know, being removed, coming back, like a year later, being removed, coming back, supposedly being removed, but not actually leaving the country and being found, you know, living in the same address 6 months later. We have thousands of cases like this going on up and down the country. You know, until we have a serious solution to the problem of deportation, you know, it's nice to believe that we have some semblance of control, and certainly it's not as severe a problem as it was, you know, last year. But these longer-term trends are still continuing.
Can I say on safe and legal routes? I mean, I think, David, the scheme you're asking for actually does exist. We have a community sponsorship scheme, which may have been created when you were in the Home Office.
A few hundred.
No, 1,000 people have come across on it, but it's open to anyone. So all of the, you know, churches, mosques, synagogues, community groups that, you know, you're referring to, if they legitimately want to sponsor somebody to come to the UK, there is a scheme that's waiting for them there. And whenever, you know, the Archbishop of Canterbury or anyone comes to me and says that we want more safe and legal routes, I say, well, we have a scheme, you know, that's waiting there. You seize on it. And I do think we've got to be a bit fairer to ourselves about what's happened, because there's a view, particularly put about by the Labour Party, that the government has been mean-spirited. Actually, as David mentioned earlier, since 2015, 530,000 people have come into the UK on humanitarian visas from all the countries that you mentioned, and others, because we also have a global scheme that's run by the United Nations. And that's more than any comparable period in our history. More than we did in the Second World War, certainly more than we did in the 1930s when people were seeking refuge then. And that is one of the reasons why the system is under immense pressure today. And in the bill that we've just passed, the Illegal Migration Act, we've said that we're going to ask every local authority in the country what capacity they have for safe and legal routes, just as you want, David, and that's going to happen this autumn. And out of that, we will forge the next wave of safe and legal routes, but it will be properly founded in capacity. It won't be that somebody comes to the UK and ends up in the Holiday Inn at Heathrow Airport. They'll come to the UK into the care of a local council that can help to integrate them into housing that's prepared for them. But we have to be honest with ourselves that there is almost no capacity at the moment. There is a housing crisis. If I asked any local authority today, I would be amazed if they said that they have, you know, much capacity to take people, much as though they might like to. So I think we need a more honest debate. And in Parliament, there are members of Parliament on all sides, but particularly on the opposition benches, who stand up and say, you know, we should be creating these routes. But then they're the very same people who will write to me as Immigration Minister saying they don't want a hotel to be opened in their constituency, or, you know, why are we not processing claims fast or something. So what I want to create is a much more honest debate where Parliament doesn't make promises that we can't keep.
Fantastic. There's so much more to dig into here, but I'm very conscious of the time, so we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience.
Oh, wow.
Wow, okay.
And anybody who doesn't want to ask a question,
Take one down the front here first, please. Yeah.
Hi there. Thanks. Hello. Yeah. Thanks for the panel. So just within the broader economic context right now,
we've obviously got high inflation at this point in time, and high wage inflation, low labour force participation. What economic role can immigration play within this context? And you know, there's the legal front for the NHS, doctors, nurses, but also then on the illegal front and for unskilled labour within some sort of supervised kind of way for strawberry picking or food, you know, related to unskilled labour. Is there a way that there can be some economic use over here to help bring down overall inflation, given that that's one of the biggest challenges at the moment?
Who would like to take that question?
I can.
Go for it, Nick.
Nobody's saying that we should have no immigration. and the immigration we should have, we should be selective about. And that should be about meeting skills needs and things like that. But in the medium to long term, we really have to get off this addiction. So you can talk about controlling and reducing immigration through, you know, the barrier method, and by limiting the number of visas you issue. You can do that, and we should do that. But in the long term, what we need to do is do things like reform our higher and further education systems, so that our universities aren't completely dependent on student visas for their finances, so that lots of universities are not offering the kind of low-value courses that they do. So that there are far more options for 18-year-olds to study in technical and applied courses, so that they can learn the skills that at the moment the country doesn't have, and we're having to import sort of bricklayers, plumbers, things that obviously a country of the population size that we have and of the sophistication of the economy and public sector we have, we should be able to do with our eyes closed, and don't, because we never prioritise it. And that can't be used as an excuse to say, well, we'll just keep immigration at its existing level until business gets round to training some more people and we get round to reforming the public sector, because let's be honest, that won't happen unless we create some pressures. So you have to do the two things together. You have to reform the public sector, I think, both in terms of education provision, but also as an employer, in particular health and social care, you know, are hugely dependent on migrant workers at the moment. At the same time as you do also control immigration through stricter visa policies.
Thank you, Nick. Lady in the jacket down here.
I heard all you said, it sounds very interesting, but I'd like to know why, appeal after appeal after appeal from the legal asylum seekers, why are we paying legal You mentioned New York and the problems there. New York is run by a Democratic mayor who is a sanctuary city, and he said all immigrants are welcome wherever they are, and that's the problem there. But back to Mr. Jenrick. Why are we paying legal aid to these people to appeal after appeal?
Well, I share your frustration. I mean, there are basic norms that we have to abide by that are embedded in our human rights legislation and treaties like the European Convention on Human Rights that give certain rights to migrants and responsibilities to the state. But is this an unbelievably convoluted and litigious process? Absolutely. And are there a lot of lawyers and legal representatives feasting on this taxpayers' expense? Yes. We've seen some appalling stories recently, like the Daily Mail's investigations, which are just the tip of the iceberg. Nick was in the Home Office for 6 years. In none of the 5 ministerial jobs I've done have I seen so much abuse of a system as I have in my 11 months at the Home Office. It is disgraceful, and we are taking steps. We've just set up a group that is going to put more pressure on lawyers and the Solicitors Regulatory Authority to weed out those law firms and rogue firms to try and stop them from abusing the system, for their personal gain.
Just very quickly, I know we have many questions. I think it's there's a great degree of abuse, but the problem is that this is actually legal in many, many cases. These people who we would consider to be gaming the system are doing so within the confines of the law. One of the problems is that the government is funding indirectly, or in some cases directly, highly ideological groups who their entire raison d'etre is to game the migration system. We have thousands upon thousands of organisations with privileged legal status because they are charities that receive money from the government that seem to spend all of their time fighting the government against its own policies. And it's very frustrating because you're creating problems for yourself further down the line. And that's probably one area that the government could nip in the bud with a minimum of discomfort.
To give you probably a better answer, the key reform that we've done is the Illegal Migration Act, which says that if you step foot on British soil illegally, having come on a small boat or otherwise, then you will be detained. Your claim will be processed, but only in the most limited fashion to see if there's a serious risk of harm of you being removed to a safe country like Rwanda, and you'll be removed there. And that is where your claim for asylum or otherwise will be processed. And so that fundamentally shortcuts the system and breaks the kind of stranglehold that you're referring to, the endless cycle of appeals and legal representatives. But we've got to get through the Supreme Court case later this month.
I thought some previous Immigration Act restricted the number of appeals to just one.
There's been a succession of acts which have changed the rights-based claims. About 10 years ago, there was legislation that made certain rights-based claims non-suspensive. That is, unless there was a risk of serious and immediate harm, you could make the claim, but it wouldn't stop your deportation, so the claim would come later. And the government has made the changes that Rob just described. But the changes that successive governments have made are still circumscribed by the rights granted under the ECHR. And so, all roads do lead back to ECHR rights, I think.
Okay, I think we'll take the next 2 questions together. So, gentleman in the middle over here, and lady at the back over there.
Hello, my name's David McNeill. I'm from the Law Society. I represent a 200-year-old, very small C conservative organisation. The reason why legal aid is available is because we still keep to the principle that no organisation is above the law, which includes the Home Office, and nobody should be beneath its protection, and that includes asylum seekers. At appeal, nearly 50% of all appeals are successful. And actually one of the managerial government issues with asylum, and why we're in crisis, is not just about the slowness of processing, it's also about casework. Actually, you'll have fewer appeals, fewer successful appeals, if actually the casework was better. So, and this constant and permanent crisis we seem to be in is actually leading to a really polarised, really aggressive argument between different sides of the debate. In many respects, getting a hold and getting a grip of the backlog and other things is actually conditioned to having a calm, slow conversation about a problem that will not be solved in a year or 6 months, but may take a decade. So that's just the point I'm making, and I just, would like to ask the panel, should we just calm down the rhetoric a bit?
Okay, and question over there.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask about the future. So, will we be able to use the same rhetoric about stopping the boats when these refugees are climate refugees, where if they're running away from, war or anything else, you can establish buffer zones, you can send them to neighbouring countries, and we have solutions in place. But what happens when the places they're living don't exist anymore, which is going to be prevalent, especially in countries like Bangladesh? Is burden sharing going to be on the table then?
Okay, rhetoric and climate refugees. Any takers? Go for it, Nick.
So you have a valid point about caseworking, and the quality of decisions is sometimes poor, and I think it's improving based on my knowledge of what's going on inside the department. But that doesn't mean that it isn't true that there is this morass of rights-based claims and processes that people can use to frustrate the system, and are quite often advised by, frankly, unscrupulous legal companies. Not all legal companies, not all lawyers. Some of my best friends are lawyers, etc. But it is undoubtedly true that some of these firms do behave in this way, and it's a big problem, and it's corroding trust in the system. So it does need to be rooted out.
Climate refugees? Or?
Yeah, I think under current paradigms, about 80 million people or so, and excuse me if I've slightly fudged the numbers, I may actually be quite significantly under, would have a totally legitimate claim for refugee status, and it's more of a question of people just haven't moved out yet. The problem here is, I don't know how it's possible to ask democratic countries, many of whom are on a downwards economic trajectory, to open up their borders. And really, this would be a question of removing the idea of the nation state, the bordered nation state in entirety, to take on the problems of the entire world. And yes, you are going to see climate change-related displacement. You're going to see a great degree of it. I just don't know how it's going to be possible to, in that long-term sense, be taking in not just 100,000 or so people through illegal migration, but we would be talking about millions upon millions of people every year who would have, under current legal frameworks, totally legitimate claims to move. And we can argue whether or not we believe it would be a moral claim as well, but the system as we currently have is just not prepared for what's coming in the future. And I think this is why it's incredibly important now, when numbers are still somewhat manageable, to really get the country together, united in acting for these future problems. If we don't do it now, we're going to face a great degree of instability, I think, in the future. If that's slightly a dark vision of what's coming, I think it's unfortunately an accurate one.
I totally agree with that, and that's the argument that Suella and I have been trying to make, that countries across the West need to prepare for what's coming. But one thing I'd say in response to you is that in recent years there seems to be this phenomenon in politics where whenever there's a problem anywhere in the world, people reach to migration as the solution, which I just don't think it is. It's not a logical answer if there is a war in a particular part of the world or there's a disaster to say the UK's number one response to that should be to set up a scheme to bring a small number of people to the UK at vast expense. The number one thing the UK should do if it wants to help that country is to fund support in that country or adjacent to it. The cost of helping a young man who's in a place of safety like France to come to the UK and integrate them into British society, provide them with social housing, teach them English, is enormous. This is hundreds of thousands of pounds. The good that could be done with the same amount of money if you gave it to an aid agency or for our own ODA budget to support people in neighbouring countries is obviously infinitely greater. That was predominantly the approach that David Cameron took when the Syrian conflict happened. We did create that scheme, which was very well regarded. But the majority, the overwhelming majority of the UK response was about helping people in refugee camps, you know, actually there on the scene of the challenge. And that is what I think the debate needs to readjust to. It can't be that if there is a war in Sudan, the first thing that people say in Parliament is, are we opening up a scheme for Sudanese people to come to the UK? That might be part of the solution, but the number one thing is, what is the UK doing using our aid, our diplomacy, our links around the world to try and help people where the conflict actually is?
And there was a good book written a few years ago by a couple of refugee academics, wasn't there, that said, you know, that it's so important to we should be investing in these kind of these sort of refugee camps that become towns. Some people live in them for decades, much of their lives. Not only make sure that they have health clinics and schools, but also allow people to work in these places. I mean, a lot of the countries ban people from working, but you could actually have live productive lives in and make these places more decent. I mean, you'd be doing much bigger favour to people than, as you say, bringing a few hundred people to live in Shepherd's Bush.
Right, well, sadly I think we're going to have to wrap up there, very conscious of the time, but thank you to our wonderful panellists, Robert, Nick, Poppy, David. Lots of insights there. So everyone else in the room, I'd say please pick up a copy of the Stopping the Crossings report from the back, sign up to our CapEx and Centre for Policy Studies emails, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you guys.